Now at this time, Jesus said, learn a lesson from the fig tree. And it was a parable, a really small made-up story that he said. Actually, it's not exactly made up. It's just a picture, a metaphor of what this whole passage in chapter 24 of Matthew is about. He said, now learn the lesson of a fig tree. And this is not what a fig tree looks like, but here's some leaves on this fig tree. And the thing about fig trees, which are not many trees like this, the leaves actually disappear. And then right before summer comes, leaves start appearing. And then you have the fruit and all of the figs. So he said, now learn this lesson from a fig tree. As soon as you see, well, let me read it. It says, as soon as the twigs get tender, the branches get tender here, he says, as soon as the branches get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Okay, here summer's about to happen. See the fig tree leaves. And by the way, he was teaching this, if you remember, on the Mount of Olives. And there were, of course, olive trees a lot on that Mount of Olives. But guess what? There were fig trees. And chances are, he's standing probably right there and he points to it. He says, hey, learn the lesson about these fig trees. And he mentions this. And so he said, probably pointing to an actual fig tree there. He says, even so, when you see all these things, so he's comparing the physical fig tree to what he's just talking about, all these things, what all these things are. What's the things in the chapter? And I think it's most of the chapter there, all these things, meaning like all the way up to the idea of the second coming, the second advent, when Jesus Christ actually comes back. And so all the way up to, in the timeline, if you have a timeline here, and he talks about all these things like verses 4 all the way to like 28 or something, all these things. And it's talking about the tribulation, the hatred that you're going to experience, the false Christ is going to come, the false prophets. And then he talks about the surrounding of the city, the desolation that's going to happen to the Jerusalem and the temple and everything. All those things are going to happen. All these troubles that's going to happen. That's the things he's already talking about. And then from that point all the way up to the second coming, like from then on all the way through this, there's a big gap there between the desolation and all that, all the way up to the second coming. There's going to be all these things that's going to happen here. And so that's when he said, I tell you the truth. Well, he says, even so, when it is near, well, first he said, even so, when it is near, or when you see all these things, you know that it is near. That, in other words, it's right at the doors, or right at the door. And by the way, in James chapter 5, it says Jesus is at the door. He's standing there. And so, in other words, he's saying, hey, it's right about to happen. And I think primarily he's talking about the first century there, because he goes on and says, I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. So that generation was the generation that he's talking about right there, the people at that time in the first century. And he said, this generation will not pass away. Now, some people died and all, but basically 30 to 40 years is a generation. And he said it's not going to pass away. Now, some people take that verse and say, well, no, that's for later. It's this generation nowadays. That's really forcing something. The most natural understanding of that passage is this generation, the ones he's talking to. So all these things happen in Matthew 24. Now, I think at the very end that we were talking about at that time, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and they will see the Son of Man coming into power and all that. Well, it could be a picture, a figurative message of Jesus Christ coming in power and judgment against Israel and against Jerusalem. So definitely could be that. But then he says, and I'm going back a little, and he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call. I think that's kind of now, that's the second coming. So he kind of jumps ahead and mentions that. But I think basically what he's saying, the things that you're hearing here, it's going to actually happen in this generation. Basically, that whole set of things, except for maybe the one verse or something, or second verse when that actually the two verses that really indicate, okay, he jumped ahead to the full coming of Jesus Christ. He says, I tell you the truth, this generation will not pass away until all these things, like this whole passage basically, will have happened. And then he goes on and says, verse 35, heaven and earth will pass away, but my word shall never pass away. I love that verse. Heaven and earth shall pass away. In other words, the sky and earth will pass away. Has it passed away? No, you still have the sky and you still have earth, and it hasn't passed away. In other words, heaven and earth will pass away before, but my words will not pass away. In other words, this will happen, you guys. You know, he really made it very strong and very secure. All right, and so I hope that helps you understand more. Jesus took a beautiful parable of the fig tree and mentioned it, and it's kind of said, hey, when you see the leaves happening, it's right there. It's at the door. It's right there. Well, it's really at the door. When they saw all these things that are happening, what he mentioned in this whole chapter, you see all these things happening, you go, wait, guys, I think it's about to happen, and it did. Jerusalem went down. The temple was destroyed. He's answering the questions of what they first asked. When and what? Thanks for listening.